which is theologians have had a number of ideas about what does it mean to be created in the image of God throughout the centuries, and three of the most common ways of talking about the image of God are, first of all, God gives us our mental and social abilities, and those abilities are far above those of animals. Two, image of God isn't so much about our abilities as it is about the relationship we have. There's personal relationships we have with each other, but even more so, we have a personal relationship with God. And that's sort of the locus of being made in the image of God. And the third, and this is one that I think has become a more common view, especially among Reformed theologians in the recent past, is the idea of God commissioning. Just as kings in the ancient Near East would put their statues, their images in the lands they ruled, God makes us living image bearers here on earth to be God's representatives and stewards in this world. So it's a commissioning. All right. Now, you don't have to pick one of those three. You can certainly have a combination of those three, and it would still work. And all three of those views are compatible with all five different scenarios on human origins and human evolution. God could give us our abilities through evolutionary processes, and then God establishes a relationship with us and commissions us through divine personal revelation. So any one of those five scenarios, any thoughts about human evolution in terms of God giving us our abilities, is certainly compatible with this. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of debate on this issue. The soul. Okay, what do we mean by the soul? This, again, is old hat for some of you who've been reading in this topic, and maybe these are some new ideas for those of you who haven't been reading a lot in this topic. If you start reading, theologians and Christian scientists and Christian philosophers are getting in on this act too. What do we mean by the soul? Well, one sort of classic view is the idea of an immaterial soul joined to a material body. Souls are miraculously created. It's a very common view. Descartes is often mentioned in this view, but certainly not the only one. And that's a very simplified view here. Another view, and here we can start looking at Thomas Aquinas and others, where you don't see the soul as an entity which is joined to the body, but more of as an organizing principle or power of the material body, and a lot more could be said about that one. And a third view goes something like this. Well, when we talk about our souls, we mean, first of all, there are mental abilities, our relational abilities. Those come out of our brains. God made wonderful brains. We have amazing brains which can think and reflect and even be self-conscious and form interpersonal relations with each other. And all of those abilities are part of the proper working of our body and our brain. But that's not everything we mean about our soul, because what we also mean is that we're in relationship with God, and there are certain divine promises like the resurrection. And that's not sort of a natural part of our bodies. That comes from God. So what we mean by our soul is our abilities to think, our mental and relational abilities to relate to God, but also God establishing a relationship with us and promises to us in our divine through revelation. All right. Now, which of these views on the soul do you think is the best? Well, we could argue about that one too. And in fact, there's a lot of papers you can go download right now which argue about that. And all I want to say today is each one of these three views is compatible with each of the five scenarios on human origins, but not all equally the same, okay? Some views work better with some scenarios, and some views work better with other scenarios, more naturally with other scenarios, but you really can make each one work with each scenario if you want to work at it. All right, next topic, moving along. Okay, so there's this whole field called evolutionary psychology, which is a wonderful, fascinating field. I was part of a seminar on Christian scholarship on this topic in summer of 2001. And some of the things I learned is, okay, if you read about biological evolution, you hear a lot of people saying that it rewards selfishness. Evolution rewards selfishness. You know, the critters that are really mean and selfish to other critters are the ones who succeed evolutionary. And yeah, okay, that's true a lot of the time. But what's really interesting is that altruism can also be rewarded by evolution when organisms start living in social groups, like wolves and dolphins and chimpanzees and hominids. When you start living in social groups, being selfish gets you kicked out of the group, and you don't do so well. And that's a gross simplification of another 1-hour talk that I could easily give. But here's the point. If God used evolutionary processes to bring about early human beings, there would be the genetic, the mental framework that sometimes urges the early human beings to be selfish, and other times, or at the same time, to be altruistic and play by the rules and be nice. And those would have been competing concepts. And if God used evolutionary processes to bring about early human beings, science has a pretty good shot. This is still early work, okay? There's evolutionary psychology, the theories are running ahead of the data, but there's a pretty good chance that scientifically we can understand how God could have produced early human beings with these competing desires, these competing motives. And so that starts to raise questions about sin. And let me just throw another analogy on the board here. So first a little cartoon. The lions have hunted and killed, and one is saying to the other, "It's a lovely day, a good meal, and thank heavens, no guilt." We presume that animals don't feel guilt. Predators don't feel guilt when they hunt and kill. I mean, if lions felt guilty, then they probably wouldn't hunt as well. But at some point, early human beings did start feeling guilt when they behaved that way towards each other, at least. And we can come up with good scientific hypotheses about this. Now let me go to the last bullet point. Little babies scream and cry and want their way all the time, and we don't say that that's willful sin. And then a little toddler screams and cries and throws a temper tantrum, and at some point we look at that and say, "All right, you're sinning now." All right, can you draw a sharp line and tell me when that child started sinning? I don't think you can. Okay, what does that mean for human origins? I don't know. I'm putting it on the table. But that gets us to the topic of original sin. All right, and one of the first things I learned when I started going more deeply into this is what we mean by the term original sin sort of depends on what you're talking about. There's the situation of original sin. No one can be righteous apart from Christ. Sounds pretty obvious, right? Not so to the early church, and I hope no theologians come here and tell me I've got my church history all wrong, but there was a debate in the early church. 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. Are humans sort of born with a blank slate? And do they learn sin from imitation? And is it theoretically possible that a human could live a perfectly righteous life? Or is it the case that sin is in all human beings right from the start, and it really is impossible for anyone to be righteous apart from Christ's work? Well, that was a debate. And the debate was settled. The church settled on no one can be righteous apart from Christ. And that is the core of the doctrine of original sin. Now, with that comes all sorts of secondary questions. That immediately raises, so how is the sinful status transmitted from generation to generation to generation? Is it primarily biological? Is it primarily through learning? Is it some sort of spiritual status? We're all now in a status of being in sin rather than in grace. Some combination of them. What about the very first historical sin? Was there a first single historical sin which was the most important one for this? Or does early chapters of Genesis talk about a whole sequence of sins just getting worse and worse and worse in the early chapters? And that's what's really driving it. What about this idea of this? I'll come back to this. Original righteousness. Humans in a state of righteousness and full intellectual development. Was that an actual state some humans were in early in human history, or was that a potential state humans might have got to? All right, now we're getting to a point where all the different scenarios started disagreeing with each other. Okay, now we're getting into issues. Now, all 5 scenarios on Adam and Eve that I laid out agree with the situation. Okay, they absolutely agree. No one can be righteous apart from Christ. as far as I can. I mean, you can obviously spin those scenarios in other ways, but all 5 of those scenarios are fully compatible with the statement, no one can be righteous apart from Christ, we are all sinners. Now, if you want to start talking about transmission, some of them work better than others. Like suppose you say there's some sort of biological element to the transmission of sinful status from generation to generation. Well, scenarios 1, 2, and 5 work, and scenarios 3 and 4 don't. Okay, Adam and Eve as representatives have a problem, but Adam and Eve as representatives, as ancestors or as symbolic, that kind of works. Let's see, spiritual status, often scenarios 3 and 4, Adam and Eve as representatives, more often favor that sin is a sort of original sin is a spiritual status. Well, you don't have to choose today, okay, you can go read a lot of theology on that. And single or multiple acts and original righteousness, well, okay, that gets into some harder questions. How critical was that very first historical sin? Was original righteousness actual or a potential state? Some of the scenarios, in particular the symbolic scenarios, are really difficult to have a lot of trouble talking about original righteousness as being an actual state. They would prefer to talk about it as a potential state. What is the role of divine revelation? Okay, we can certainly imagine, and I certainly do, at some point was the first historical revelations. Whatever method God used to bring about the very first human beings, our human ancestors, at some point we get what we would call divine revelation. Okay, we have God's revelation to Moses, we have God's revelation to Abraham, we go backwards. What was that first revelation like? Did God pick a group of early human beings and speak from the sky, speak from a burning bush, speak through the voice of conscience, speak through a prophet among them? I don't know. But once divine revelation is on the table, now things are changed, aren't they? Right? Because once God reveals to human beings by whatever means, okay, you've got these competing desires, but this is how you ought to live, and how you treat other people has consequences for your relationship to me. Now certainly there's no doubt we're talking about the possibility of sin. Okay? So divine revelation is certainly an important feature of all these different scenarios of human origins, especially when we start to talk about original sin and the first historical sin. But what else can we talk about? If you think that the best scenarios for human origins include not only divine revelation, but also some sort of transformation, God not only working through naturally understandable, scientifically understandable natural processes, but also God performing some sort of spiritual transformation or biological or physical transformation. Now that can be part of your scenario about you're talking about the first human beings and the first potential for sin. And so that raises the question, how intellectually, emotionally, morally advanced were the first sinners? Again, my understanding of church history has the Western church typically viewing Adam and Eve as quite intellectually adult, morally advanced, and the Eastern traditions of Christianity seeing them more as, what's the right word? Less advanced? Help me out here? Childlike? More childlike. Okay, so we've got these different traditions within Christianity on this question. Okay, so that's certainly something we can talk about some more here. What about human mortality? Often the question is phrased this way. Do the scripture passages which talk about death as a consequence of sin refer to spiritual death, separation from God, or do they talk about physical immortality as possible by God's grace? Not that the early human beings were naturally immortal, because why would you need a tree of life? So the tree of life is thought to represent the possibility by God's grace of physical immortality had our earliest human parents not sinned. Okay, if that's what you want, if your interpretation of Scripture